The morning sun cast long shadows across the Naval Special Warfare Training Center as Captain Sarah Mitchell adjusted her civilian clothes one last time. Today marked the beginning of an unusual assignment that would test not only her leadership skills but also her ability to remain undercover among the very people she would soon command. Sarah had spent 15 years climbing the ranks of the Navy SEALs, breaking barriers that many thought were impossible to cross. Her record was flawless: decorated combat veteran, expert in underwater demolition, and a tactical genius who had led some of the most dangerous missions in recent military history. But now, at 38, she faced perhaps her greatest challenge yet. The Pentagon had received troubling reports about harassment and discrimination at the training facility. Several female cadets had filed complaints, but investigations had hit dead ends. The perpetrators were clever, operating in shadows where official oversight couldn't reach. That's when Admiral Roberts approached Sarah with an unconventional solution. "We need someone on the inside," he had explained during their classified briefing 3 weeks earlier. "Someone who can see what really happens when the brass isn't watching. You'll go in as a new transfer, keep your real identity hidden, and document everything." Sarah understood the risks. If discovered, it could end her career. But she also understood the importance of the mission. Young women were being driven out of military service before they even had a chance to prove themselves. The pattern had to stop. The cover story was carefully crafted. Sarah Mitchell became Sarah Thompson, a late-entry recruit who had previously served in the Coast Guard. Her record showed average performance, good enough to be accepted into the program, but nothing that would draw special attention. Her appearance was deliberately unremarkable: brown hair pulled back in a regulation ponytail, minimal makeup, and the kind of quiet confidence that could easily be mistaken for nervousness. As she walked through the gates of the facility, Sarah felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. She had commanded elite teams in hostile territories, made split-second decisions that saved lives, and earned the respect of some of the toughest warriors in the world. Yet somehow, walking into this training center as a supposed rookie felt more daunting than any combat mission. The first few days passed without major incident. Sarah quickly identified the key players among both instructors and cadets. There was drill instructor Martinez, a 20-year veteran who ran his sessions with firm but fair discipline. Lieutenant Commander Hayes seemed professional on the surface, but had a way of looking at female cadets that made Sarah's skin crawl. Among the cadets themselves, a clear hierarchy had emerged. At the top of the social structure sat Brandon "Tank" Morrison, a former college football player whose father was a retired Navy admiral. Tank had the kind of natural charisma that drew others to him, but Sarah noticed how that charm could quickly turn cold when he dealt with people he considered beneath him. His inner circle included Jake Stevens, a wiry kid from Texas who seemed to live for Tank's approval, and Marcus Rodriguez, whose quiet intensity masked a cruel streak. Then there were the targets, primarily the handful of female cadets who had somehow made it through the initial screening. Jennifer Walsh was a marine biologist who had joined the Navy to serve her country. Ashley Chen had given up a promising career in engineering. Maria Santos came from a military family and dreamed of following in her father's footsteps. Each of them was intelligent, capable, and determined. Each of them was also slowly being worn down by a campaign of subtle intimidation and harassment. Sarah watched it all with the trained eye of someone who had spent years reading people and situations. The harassment was systematic and clever. It happened during PT when instructors were focused elsewhere. It occurred in the mess hall where conversations could be passed off as harmless banter. Most insidiously, it took place in the barracks after lights out, where whispered threats and accidents with equipment created an atmosphere of constant tension. The perpetrators had refined their methods through practice. They knew exactly how to walk the line between what could be proven and what would be dismissed as normal military hazing. When Jennifer reported that someone had tampered with her gear, the investigation found insufficient evidence. When Ashley complained about inappropriate comments, witnesses suddenly developed selective memory. When Maria's bunk was repeatedly vandalized, it was written off as pranks. Sarah documented everything in a hidden journal using a code she had developed during intelligence operations. She photographed damaged equipment, recorded conversations when possible, and carefully noted patterns of behavior. But she also understood that her most valuable evidence would come from experiencing the harassment firsthand. That opportunity came during the third week of her assignment. Sarah had deliberately positioned herself as a loner, someone who didn't quite fit in with either the male or female groups. She was friendly enough to avoid suspicion, but quiet enough to be overlooked. It was a delicate balance that required all of her undercover training. The breaking point came on a Wednesday evening after a particularly grueling day of combat training. Sarah had performed well during the exercises, well enough to complete the tasks, but not so well as to stand out. As she headed to the shower facilities, she noticed Jennifer Walsh walking ahead of her, shoulders slumped with exhaustion. The shower area was divided into individual stalls with curtained entrances. It was supposed to provide privacy and dignity for all personnel, regardless of gender. But as Sarah entered the facility, she immediately sensed something was wrong. The air felt charged with malicious anticipation, and she could hear hushed voices coming from the direction of Jennifer's stall. Moving quietly, Sarah positioned herself where she could observe without being seen. What she witnessed made her blood boil, but her years of training kept her expression neutral. Tank Morrison and his crew had cornered Jennifer in her stall. They weren't physically touching her, but their presence was intimidating and clearly unwelcome. Their comments were crude and designed to humiliate. "Maybe you should consider a different career path," Tank was saying, his voice carrying just enough volume to be heard by others in the facility. "Something more suited to your capabilities." Jake Stevens snickered. "Yeah, maybe something in an office, away from real warriors." Sarah recognized the tactic immediately. It was psychological warfare designed to break down the target's confidence and self-worth. The perpetrators could later claim they were just offering career advice or engaging in normal military banter. But the intent was clear: drive the female cadets out through sustained psychological pressure. Jennifer stood her ground, but Sarah could see the fear in her eyes. The young woman was alone, outnumbered, and vulnerable. In that moment, Sarah faced a critical decision. She could maintain her cover and continue gathering evidence, or she could intervene and risk exposing herself. Her instincts as a protector warred with her duty as an undercover investigator. Before she could decide, the situation escalated. Marcus Rodriguez stepped closer to Jennifer's stall, effectively blocking her exit. "You know," he said in a voice that carried barely concealed menace, "accidents happen during training. Equipment fails. People get hurt. Maybe you should think about that." The threat was unmistakable, and Sarah knew she couldn't stand by any longer. But as she prepared to step forward, she heard footsteps approaching the shower area. Tank and his crew heard them too and quickly dispersed, melting away like shadows. Jennifer was left alone, shaking with a mixture of fear and rage. That night, Sarah lay awake planning her next move. She had enough evidence to begin building a case, but she knew the harassment would only escalate. The perpetrators were growing bolder, more confident in their ability to operate without consequences. It was only a matter of time before someone got seriously hurt. The next morning brought news that confirmed Sarah's worst fears. Ashley Chen had submitted a request for transfer, citing personal reasons. But Sarah had seen the bruises on Ashley's arms during PT, bruises that hadn't been there the day before. Another promising young warrior was being driven out of service, and the system was failing to protect her. As Sarah watched Ashley pack her belongings, she made a silent promise. This pattern of abuse and intimidation would end, even if it meant sacrificing her own cover in the process. She had sworn an oath to protect and defend, and that oath didn't come with exceptions for convenience or career advancement. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test everything Sarah had learned in her 15 years of military service. She had faced enemy fire, led men and women through impossible situations, and earned her place among the elite. Now she would have to prove that her values were stronger than her desire for self-preservation. The shower incident had shown her that the harassment was escalating beyond psychological intimidation. Physical threats were becoming part of the pattern, and Sarah knew that physical violence would soon follow. She couldn't allow that to happen, even if it meant revealing her true identity before her investigation was complete. As she prepared for another day of training, Sarah checked her hidden recording equipment and reviewed her documented evidence. She had built a solid case, but she suspected that the most important chapter of her investigation was about to begin. The perpetrators had grown comfortable in their belief that they were untouchable. That comfort would soon become their downfall. The morning briefing proceeded normally, with instructions for the day's training exercises. But Sarah noticed the looks passing between Tank and his crew, the way they seemed to be planning something. Jennifer Walsh appeared more withdrawn than usual, clearly affected by the previous night's encounter. The tension in the air was palpable to anyone who knew how to read it. Sarah realized that her time as an observer was coming to an end. Soon she would have to choose between maintaining her cover and protecting the people she had sworn to serve. It was a choice that would define not only the success of her mission, but also her legacy as a leader and a warrior. The next phase of her investigation would be the most dangerous yet, as the harassment campaign reached a crescendo that would force her hand and reveal the true character of everyone involved. The morning of the incident began like any other, with reveille at 500 hours and the usual rush to the mess hall. But Sarah noticed an undercurrent of anticipation among Tank Morrison's group that set her nerves on edge. During breakfast, she observed subtle signals passing between the conspirators, meaningful glances, barely perceptible nods, and whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when others approached. Jennifer Walsh sat alone at a corner table, mechanically eating her oatmeal while staring at nothing in particular. The previous night's confrontation had clearly shaken her, but Sarah recognized the stubborn set of her jaw. Jennifer wasn't ready to quit, despite the mounting pressure. That determination would make her an even bigger target. The morning's training focused on underwater demolition techniques, one of the most challenging aspects of SEAL preparation. Sarah found herself in the same group as Jennifer, Tank, and several others. As they suited up in diving gear, she noticed Tank making exaggerated comments about equipment failures and underwater accidents. His words were carefully chosen to sound like general safety reminders, but his eyes remained fixed on Jennifer as he spoke. "Remember," Tank announced loudly enough for everyone to hear, "the ocean doesn't care about your feelings or your politics. It'll kill you just as quick as any enemy, maybe quicker." Several cadets laughed, but Sarah caught the underlying message. The psychological warfare was continuing, designed to plant seeds of doubt and fear. During the underwater exercise, Sarah kept Jennifer within sight while maintaining her cover as just another struggling cadet. The young marine biologist was actually quite skilled in the water, her scientific background giving her an intuitive understanding of the aquatic environment. But Sarah noticed that every time Jennifer surfaced, Tank or one of his crew would be nearby, making comments about her technique or questioning her breathing patterns. The harassment was constant, but subtle enough to avoid official notice. When Jennifer struggled briefly with a piece of equipment, Jake Stevens loudly suggested that maybe she wasn't cut out for the physical demands of the program. When she successfully completed a difficult underwater navigation course, Marcus Rodriguez dismissed it as beginner's luck and warned that the real tests were still coming. Sarah documented everything while fighting her own growing anger. She had seen this pattern before in combat zones where weak leaders allowed toxic behavior to flourish. The difference was that in combat, such behavior usually got people killed quickly. Here, in the supposed safety of a training environment, it was allowed to metastasize like a cancer. After the diving exercise, the cadets returned to the barracks for equipment maintenance and personal time. Sarah used this opportunity to discreetly check on Jennifer, who was sitting on her bunk reviewing training manuals with unusual intensity. The young woman's hands shook slightly as she turned the pages, betraying the stress she was trying to hide. "Studying hard?" Sarah asked casually, sitting on a nearby bunk. Jennifer looked up with tired eyes. "Trying to stay ahead of the curve," she replied. "Seems like some people are just waiting for me to fail." Sarah wanted to offer reassurance and support, but she had to maintain her cover. Instead, she nodded sympathetically and made a non-committal comment about the challenging nature of the program. But she made mental notes about Jennifer's emotional state and the visible toll the harassment was taking. As evening approached, Sarah noticed increased activity among Tank's group. They huddled together during dinner, speaking in low voices and occasionally glancing toward the female cadets' table. Whatever they were planning, it was coming soon. Sarah's instincts, honed by years of combat experience, told her that the situation was about to escalate dramatically. After dinner, the cadets were given time for personal hygiene and equipment preparation before lights out. Sarah deliberately lingered in the common area, pretending to read while actually observing the movements of the key players. Tank and his crew seemed to be waiting for something, checking their watches frequently and maintaining unusual vigilance. Around 2100 hours, Jennifer headed toward the shower facilities, carrying her toiletry kit and a clean uniform for the next day. Sarah waited a few minutes, then casually gathered her own shower supplies and followed at a discreet distance. Her warrior instincts were screaming warnings, and she trusted those instincts with her life. The shower facility was nearly empty when Sarah entered. She could hear water running from Jennifer's stall and chose a location that would give her a clear view of the entrances. As she prepared for her own shower, she heard footsteps in the corridor outside. Multiple sets of feet moving with the careful coordination of a planned operation. Tank Morrison entered first, followed by Jake Stevens and Marcus Rodriguez. They moved with predatory confidence, believing themselves to be operating in a consequence-free environment. Their body language spoke of men who had done this before and expected no resistance. "Well, well," Tank announced loudly, his voice echoing off the tiled walls. "Look who's here all by herself." Jennifer's water stopped running, and Sarah heard the sound of someone moving quickly in a stall. "I'm busy," Jennifer called out, trying to keep her voice steady. "Find somewhere else to shower." Jake Stevens laughed unpleasantly. "Public facility, sweetheart. We've got just as much right to be here as you do." Sarah continued her own preparations, seemingly oblivious to the developing situation, but actually calculating angles and distances. She had fought in close quarters before, in places where every second and every inch mattered. The shower facility was actually advantageous terrain for someone with her training. Multiple escape routes, hard surfaces for leverage, and numerous improvised weapons within reach. Marcus Rodriguez positioned himself near Jennifer's stall, effectively blocking her exit. "You know," he said conversationally, "I've been thinking about our little chat yesterday. Maybe you didn't understand what we were trying to tell you." "I understood perfectly," Jennifer replied, her voice gaining strength, "and I'm not going anywhere." Tank stepped closer, his voice taking on a more threatening tone. "See, that's where you're wrong. This program isn't for people like you. We're trying to save you from getting hurt, because accidents happen, equipment fails, people disappear during training exercises." The threat was no longer subtle. Sarah recognized it as a classic intimidation tactic designed to break down the target's resistance through fear. But she also heard something else in Tank's voice: escalation. The psychological warfare was transitioning to something more direct and dangerous. "Move away from my stall," Jennifer demanded, but her voice betrayed her growing fear. Jake Stevens moved to block the main exit from the shower area. "Maybe we need to make this clearer for you," he said. "This is your last chance to request a transfer. After tonight, things get more difficult." Sarah realized that the situation was reaching a critical point. The three men had Jennifer trapped, and their intentions were becoming increasingly clear. They weren't planning to physically assault her. They were too smart for that level of obvious criminality. But they were escalating to a level of intimidation that could cause serious psychological harm and might trigger a violent response from their target. In that moment, Sarah faced the defining choice of her undercover mission. She had gathered substantial evidence of the harassment pattern, enough to build a strong case for prosecution. But the immediate danger to Jennifer required action that would likely blow her cover and potentially compromise the broader investigation. Her training as a SEAL had taught her that the mission always came first, but her deeper training as a warrior and protector demanded that she prioritize the immediate safety of those under her protection. The conflict between these two imperatives created a tension that had to be resolved in seconds. Jennifer tried to push past Marcus Rodriguez, who deliberately stepped into her path. "Excuse me," she said firmly, but he didn't move. "Not until we're finished talking," Marcus replied, his voice carrying a menace that made Sarah's hands clench into fists. Tank Morrison stepped even closer to Jennifer's stall. "You see, the problem is that you don't seem to understand how things work around here. Maybe we need to give you a more hands-on demonstration." The final word was accompanied by Tank reaching toward Jennifer's stall curtain. In that instant, Sarah knew that the line was about to be crossed from psychological intimidation to physical assault. Her decision was made not by careful analysis, but by the warrior's code that had guided her entire military career. "That's enough," Sarah said quietly, but her voice carried an authority that made all four people freeze. Tank turned toward her with surprise and annoyance. "Mind your own business, Thompson. This doesn't concern you." Sarah stepped out of her stall, no longer attempting to hide the confidence and capability that marked her as a professional warrior. Her posture and movement patterns shifted subtly but unmistakably from those of a nervous recruit to those of someone who had faced life-and-death situations and emerged victorious. "I'm making it my business," she replied, her voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that experienced military personnel recognized instinctively. Jake Stevens laughed nervously. "What are you going to do? Report us? Good luck with that." Sarah smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. "Oh, I'm not going to report you," she said. "I'm going to give you one chance to walk away from this situation before you make the biggest mistake of your military careers." The three men looked at each other with confusion and growing concern. Something in Sarah's demeanor had shifted dramatically, and even their limited military experience was enough to recognize the change. Tank tried to reassert his dominance through bluster. "You think you can intimidate us? You're nothing but another wannabe who'll wash out within a month." Sarah's expression didn't change, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. "Jennifer," she said without taking her eyes off Tank, "get your things and leave. Now." Jennifer, recognizing an opportunity for escape, quickly gathered her belongings and moved toward the exit, but Jake Stevens stepped into her path again, apparently not yet understanding the gravity of the situation. "Nobody said she could leave," he announced, trying to maintain the group's control of the situation. That's when Sarah decided that the time for warnings had passed. The mission parameters had changed, and she was no longer operating as an undercover investigator. She was now functioning as a SEAL commander, faced with a clear threat to personnel under her protection. What happened next would depend entirely on how quickly Tank Morrison and his crew realized that they had made a catastrophic error in judgment. The quiet recruit they had dismissed as irrelevant was about to reveal herself as something far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. The shower facility, which had been the scene of systematic intimidation and harassment, was about to become the stage for a demonstration of what real military competence looked like. Sarah had spent 15 years learning to be the kind of warrior that others could depend on when everything went wrong. Tank Morrison was about to learn that some people were not as helpless as they appeared. Jake Stevens reached out to grab Jennifer's arm as she tried to leave, and that simple action triggered a response that would be talked about at the Naval Special Warfare Training Center for years to come. Sarah moved with the fluid precision of someone who had spent 15 years mastering the art of close-quarters combat. In one smooth motion, she intercepted Jake's reaching arm, applied a joint lock that brought him to his knees, and positioned herself between the three men and Jennifer. The entire sequence took less than 3 seconds and was executed with such professional competence that all 4 witnesses stood frozen in shock. "I said she's leaving," Sarah repeated, her voice carrying an Arctic calm that spoke of absolute confidence in her ability to control the situation. Tank Morrison stared at the woman he had dismissed as a weak recruit, trying to process what he had just witnessed. Jake Stevens was kneeling on the wet floor, his arm extended at an angle that made it clear any resistance would result in significant pain. Marcus Rodriguez had taken an involuntary step backward, his survival instincts finally recognizing danger. "How did you—" Tank began, but Sarah cut him off with a look that could have frozen seawater. "Jennifer, leave now," Sarah commanded without taking her eyes off the 3 men. "Go straight to your bunk and stay there until morning formation." Jennifer didn't need to be told twice. She grabbed her belongings and practically sprinted from the shower facility, leaving behind the tableau of 3 would-be harassers being controlled by someone they had dramatically underestimated. Sarah released Jake's arm and stepped back, but her positioning made it clear that she was ready for whatever came next. "Now," she said conversationally, "we need to have a discussion about respect, military discipline, and the consequences of poor decision-making." Tank tried to reassert his authority through volume and bluster. "You have no idea who you're messing with, Thompson. My father is Admiral Morrison, and he'll have you court-martialed for this." Sarah smiled, and this time it was genuinely amused. "Admiral Charles Morrison? Interesting. I served under him during the Kandahar operation in 2019. Good man. Dedicated officer. I wonder what he would think about his son's extracurricular activities." The casual mention of a classified operation that only senior personnel would know about sent another shockwave through Tank's understanding of the situation. But his pride and arrogance prevented him from backing down gracefully. "You're lying," he said, but there was less confidence in his voice. "No way someone like you served in Afghanistan." Sarah's expression grew more serious. "Someone like me? Let me tell you about someone like me." She reached into her pocket and produced a small device that she activated with her thumb. "My name is Captain Sarah Mitchell, Naval Special Warfare Command. I've been conducting an undercover investigation into harassment and discrimination at this facility for the past month." The revelation hit the 3 men like a physical blow. Jake Stevens actually stumbled backward, his face draining of color. Marcus Rodriguez began looking for escape routes, finally understanding that the situation had spiraled completely out of his control. Tank Morrison stood frozen, his mind struggling to process the implications of what he had just learned. "For the past 4 weeks," Sarah continued, "I have been documenting a systematic campaign of harassment, intimidation, and discrimination directed primarily at female cadets, but also affecting other personnel deemed unworthy by your little group." She pulled out her phone and scrolled through several screens of photos and video files. I have evidence of equipment tampering, recorded conversations, documented threats, and testimony from multiple victims. What just happened here represents the culmination of a pattern of escalating abuse that would have resulted in serious charges even before tonight's incident. Tank finally found his voice, but it came out as a croak. You can't. This is entrapment. You can't use anything you recorded without our permission. Sarah looked at him with genuine pity. Tank, you have fundamentally misunderstood both the law and the military justice system. As an active duty officer conducting an authorized investigation into criminal activity, I have extensive authority to gather evidence. Everything I've documented is admissible and actionable. She gestured around the shower facility. But more importantly, what happened here tonight moved far beyond harassment into the realm of criminal threatening and attempted assault. I observed 3 male cadets corner a female cadet in a vulnerable location, issue direct threats about physical harm, and attempt to physically prevent her from leaving. That's not a training issue or a discipline problem. That's criminal behavior. Jake Stevens was now visibly shaking. We never touched her. We were just talking. You blocked her exit, issued threats about accidents and equipment failures, and one of you attempted to physically grab her when she tried to leave, Sarah replied. In military law, that constitutes unlawful restraint and criminal threatening at minimum. Depending on how the prosecutor wants to charge it, it could qualify as attempted kidnapping. Marcus Rodriguez finally spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper. What happens now? Sarah checked her watch. In approximately 6 hours, Admiral Roberts and a team of investigators will arrive at this facility to begin formal proceedings. By that time, I will have filed my complete report, including tonight's incident. You 3 will be confined to quarters under guard pending the arrival of military police. She paused, letting the full weight of their situation sink in. Your military careers are effectively over, depending on the final charges and how cooperative you choose to be with investigators. You're looking at anything from administrative discharge to significant prison time. Tank Morrison made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. Wait a minute. You can't prove anything that happened here tonight. It's your word against ours, and you were operating under false pretenses. Sarah's smile returned, but this time it was purely predatory. Tank, let me explain something about modern military operations. Do you see this device I activated earlier? She held up the small electronic unit. This is a military-grade recording device. Everything that's happened in this room for the past 15 minutes has been captured in high-definition audio and video. The final piece of hope drained from the 3 men's faces as they realized the complete scope of their predicament. Not only had they been caught in the act of harassment and intimidation, but they had done so while being recorded by a senior officer conducting an official investigation. Furthermore, Sarah continued, this facility is equipped with security cameras in common areas, including the corridor outside this shower room. The cameras will show you 3 entering together and positioning yourselves to prevent Jennifer from leaving. They'll also show her running out in obvious distress. She secured the recording device and stepped toward the exit. You have a choice to make in the next few hours. You can cooperate fully with the investigation, provide testimony about other incidents and participants, and potentially receive some consideration for your cooperation. Or you can try to fight this and face the full consequences of your actions. As she reached the doorway, Sarah turned back one more time. For what it's worth, I want you to understand something. This investigation isn't about destroying careers or ruining lives. It's about protecting the people who come to serve their country with honor and dedication. Jennifer Walsh is a brilliant young woman who could make significant contributions to our military. Ashley Chen, Maria Santos, and the others who have been targeted are exactly the kind of people we need in the service. Her voice took on a note of genuine sadness. You three could have been good officers if you had chosen to channel your leadership abilities toward positive goals. Instead, you chose to use your influence to hurt and intimidate others. That choice has consequences. Tank Morrison made one final attempt at defiance. This isn't over. My father will hear about this, and he'll make sure you pay for what you've done. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. Actually, Admiral Morrison will be part of the reviewing panel for this case. I spoke with him yesterday evening and briefed him on the general parameters of the investigation. He was quite concerned about the reports of harassment, and specifically requested to be involved in the resolution process. The irony was devastating. Tank had been counting on his father's influence to protect him, never realizing that his father's commitment to military honor would make him one of the investigation's strongest supporters. Admiral Morrison served with distinction for 30 years, Sarah continued. He earned his rank through competence, integrity, and dedication to the welfare of his personnel. I suspect he's going to be quite disappointed to learn what his son has been doing with the opportunities he's been given. With that final observation, Sarah left the three men alone in the shower facility to contemplate the wreckage of their military futures. As she walked back to the barracks, she felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. The investigation had been successful beyond her expectations, but the price had been the destruction of 3 promising careers. Within hours, the facility would be swarming with investigators, military police, and senior officers. The systematic harassment that had driven talented personnel from the service would be exposed and eliminated. New policies and oversight procedures would be implemented to prevent similar situations in the future. Jennifer Walsh would complete her training and go on to serve with distinction, eventually becoming one of the Navy's leading experts in underwater reconnaissance. Ashley Chen would be convinced to withdraw her transfer request and would later pioneer new engineering techniques for special operations equipment. Maria Santos would honor her family's military tradition while blazing new trails for the next generation of female warriors. As for Tank Morrison, Jake Stevens, and Marcus Rodriguez, their military careers ended that night in a shower facility where they learned the hard way that their victims were not as powerless as they had assumed. More importantly, they learned that the military they claimed to serve had no tolerance for those who preyed upon their fellow service members. Captain Sarah Mitchell's investigation would become a landmark case study in military justice and personnel protection. Her willingness to put herself in harm's way to protect others would earn her commendations and set new standards for undercover operations in military environments. But perhaps most importantly, her actions that night sent a clear message throughout the naval special warfare community. Harassment, intimidation, and discrimination would not be tolerated, and those who engaged in such behavior would face swift and decisive consequences, regardless of their connections or perceived immunity. The shower facility incident became a turning point, not just for the training center, but for military culture as a whole. It proved that honor, integrity, and courage were not just words in a manual, but living principles that demanded action when tested. In the years that followed, the story of the cadets who trapped what they thought was a helpless recruit in the showers only to discover she was a decorated SEAL commander would be told and retold as a reminder that in the military, you never know who you're really dealing with, and that true strength comes not from the ability to intimidate others, but from the courage to protect them.